Welcome to our channel, where history comes alive through stories of power, culture, and legacy. In this series, we uncover the brilliance of Tudor propaganda, revealing how portraits, pageants, and symbols shaped opinion, built authority, and forged dynastic strength in ways that still influence identity today. Decoding Tudor propaganda, power through image, portraits, pageants, and symbols. Part 1. Origins of Tudor image-making. From the very beginnings of the Tudor dynasty, the art of shaping public perception through imagery became an essential tool of survival, for the Tudors rose to power in an England fractured by civil war, mistrust, and dynastic uncertainty, and they quickly recognized that controlling how they were seen, both literally through painted likenesses and symbolically through emblems, architecture, and staged performances, was as crucial as winning battles or passing laws, because the dynasty itself was young, untested, and vulnerable. And so Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, embarked on a deliberate campaign to craft an image of stability, legitimacy, and divine favor, drawing upon medieval traditions of kingship while introducing a new sophistication in how power was displayed, laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most calculated and enduring visual propaganda machines in European history. At the heart of this effort was the acknowledgement that images did not merely reflect reality, but actively constructed it, meaning that when a monarch was depicted in portraiture as regal, majestic, and unchallengeable, the image itself became part of the political fabric, subtly persuading subjects to accept and internalize that vision of authority. And in a society where literacy was limited, but symbolism was universally understood, the potency of images could not be overstated, for they transcended barriers of education, language, and region, embedding themselves in collective memory more effectively than proclamations or speeches could ever hope to achieve. The Tudors were not the first rulers to use imagery for political ends, of course, for medieval kings had long employed heraldry, coinage, seals, and church patronage to emphasize their status. But what distinguished the Tudors was the scale, precision, and self-awareness of their visual strategies, as they inherited a fractured realm in desperate need of unifying symbols and cohesive narratives, and in this sense, the dynasty's origins compelled them toward a heightened reliance on propaganda, because without the weight of centuries of unbroken lineage, the Tudor claim had to be manufactured, reinforced, and displayed with a consistency that could withstand scrutiny from rivals both at home and abroad. Early on, the imagery of reconciliation was paramount, most famously embodied in the emblem of the Tudor rose, which combined the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, signaling the supposed healing of the Wars of the Roses. Yet this symbol was not a mere decorative flourish, but a carefully engineered visual shorthand that condensed a complicated political message into a single, easily recognizable form, capable of being carved on buildings, woven into fabrics, painted in manuscripts, and circulated on coins, ensuring that every subject encountered it in daily life and absorbed its message of unity, even if subconsciously. The crafting of legitimacy also drew heavily upon marriage alliances, for when Henry VII wed Elizabeth of York, the union was not simply a dynastic arrangement, but a performative act, staged with lavish ceremony and imagery that highlighted the merging of rival houses into one new divinely sanctioned dynasty and the visual culture surrounding the marriage. Heraldic displays, banners, illuminated manuscripts, and celebratory pageantry served as a kind of living propaganda that reached far beyond the immediate audience of courtiers, filtering into towns and villages through traveling performers, stained glass windows, and oral retellings that carried the imagery of reconciliation across the kingdom. What is striking about these origins is how quickly the Tudors understood that power had to be seen to be believed, and thus, Even in the first years of the dynasty, royal appearances were choreographed to emphasize majesty, with the king processing through London in gilded carriages beneath triumphal arches erected by the city's guilds and surrounded by symbols of prosperity and justice. Each detail designed to impress upon the people not only the authority of their ruler, but the inevitability of Tudor rule itself. For propaganda works not by argument, but by presenting power as a natural, unquestionable condition. This origin stage also reveals the dual audience of Tudor imagery, for on the one hand, it sought to reassure domestic subjects that stability had been restored, while on the other, it aimed to impress foreign courts, where ambassadors reported on the magnificence of English ceremonies and the splendor of its monarch. And these reports, circulated back in Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, became another layer of image-making, ensuring that the Tudors projected strength internationally, discouraging rivals from exploiting the kingdom's internal fragility. Religious imagery, too, played an important role in these early years, as Henry VII deliberately associated his rule with divine providence, commissioning artworks and church decorations that framed his reign as the fulfillment of God's will, and the visual blending of sacred and royal symbols conveyed a powerful message. To obey the Tudor monarch was to obey God himself, a theme that would recur in later reigns with ever greater intensity, but whose roots lay in this initial period of dynastic establishment. The origins of Tudor propaganda thus combined traditional medieval forms with a forward-looking sense of branding, for by standardizing emblems, repeating symbols across media, and ensuring that the king's image was visible in multiple forms, from the smallest coin to the grandest architectural projects, the Tudors achieved a saturation effect, where their legitimacy was not a matter of debate, but a visual reality embedded in every corner of the realm. And in this sense, the origins were less about innovation than about systematic, relentless deployment of imagery, turning symbols into tools of governance and spectacle into a substitute for inherited stability. As the dynasty progressed, these origins would expand into more elaborate forms of propaganda, but the seeds were planted here in a moment when survival required more than military victories or legal claims, when perception itself became a battlefield, and when the Tudors, perhaps more than any previous rulers of England, recognized that in order to rule the imagination of their people, they first had to construct it, image by image, symbol by symbol, until the dynasty itself became inseparable from the imagery that sustained it. Part 2. Henry VII and the Architecture of Legitimacy. When Henry VII secured the throne after Bosworth in 1485, his kingship rested on precarious foundations, for though victory in battle gave him the crown, it did not erase doubts about his lineage or the fragility of his claim. And so, architecture, monuments and visual staging became central to his strategy of consolidating authority, turning stone, timber, and glass into instruments of legitimacy, designed not only to endure, but to project permanence, stability, and dynastic grandeur. For buildings outlast proclamations and ceremonies, embedding messages of power into the very landscape of the realm. One of the most telling examples of this architectural propaganda was Henry's extensive rebuilding of Westminster Abbey's Lady Chapel, later known as the Henry VII Chapel, a space constructed with breathtaking intricacy in perpendicular Gothic style, lavishly adorned with fan-vaulting sculpted angels and heraldic emblems, so that the visitor entering it would encounter a fusion of religious reverence and royal magnificence, the space itself a sermon in stone, proclaiming the king's divinely sanctioned rule while preparing the ground for his dynastic tomb. For Henry understood that death itself had to be staged in ways that reinforced legitimacy, ensuring that posterity would encounter him not as a disputed usurper, but as the founder of a line anchored in divine grandeur. Beyond Westminster, Henry VII used architectural patronage as a visible declaration of continuity with England's deep traditions, for by embellishing established religious centres, repairing war-damaged structures, and erecting new colleges such as at Cambridge, he presented himself as a restorer king, one who healed the wounds of civil conflict by investing in institutions that symbolized learning, faith, and national cohesion. And each cornerstone laid or stained glass window installed carried not only a religious or civic function, but also a political message. That the Tudors were builders rather than destroyers, givers of prosperity rather than perpetuators of strife. Castles and palaces, too, played their part in this architecture of legitimacy. For Henry modernized and expanded several royal residences, including Richmond Palace, which combined defensive solidity with Renaissance-inspired comfort, a visual metaphor for his reign. Secure yet progressive, strong yet refined, and these residences acted as backdrops for ceremonies, audiences and feasts, where the architecture itself reinforced hierarchy with long processional halls, grand chambers and symbolic decor guiding the eye toward the sovereign, so that the very movement of courtiers through these spaces was an education in the structure of power. Importantly, Henry VII also used architecture to broadcast dynastic union, embedding the Tudor rose, portcullis, and other heraldic devices into the masonry of new and renovated buildings, so that walls and doorways became permanent billboards for the story of reconciliation between York and Lancaster. And this integration of symbols into physical structures meant that the dynasty's message was inescapable, etched into the daily environment of both the elite and the commoner, ensuring that loyalty was reinforced not just through ritual, but through the very fabric of lived space. The City of London provided a particularly potent stage for this architectural propaganda, as Henry cultivated strong ties with the capital's guilds and civic leaders, encouraging elaborate public works and triumphal displays that framed him as both protector and beneficiary of the city's prosperity, and triumphal arches, painted pageants and temporary wooden structures erected during royal entries were not ephemeral diversions, but carefully orchestrated visual texts, each scene celebrating the virtues of peace, justice, and dynastic renewal, thus transforming urban space into a theater of loyalty. Religious architecture carried additional weight during his reign because of the ever-present threat of rival claimants, pretenders like Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel, who sought to undermine his rule. And by visibly supporting the church through endowments, chantries, and chapel construction, Henry projected himself as a pious monarch under God's protection, a ruler whose legitimacy was sanctified in the very buildings of worship that anchored community life. And this investment served to counter whispers of illegitimacy by embedding his dynasty in sacred spaces that could not be easily contested. Yet architecture was not only about grandeur and permanence. It also carried subtle messaging in design choices. For Henry's preference for Gothic, at a time when Renaissance styles were beginning to spread, was itself a calculated decision to emphasize continuity with England's medieval past, rather than risking association with foreign fashions that might alienate his subjects. And while Italianate elements crept in through decorative details, the overarching style of his buildings reassured the people that he was rooted in native tradition, a subtle but effective form of propaganda that grounded his reign in familiarity. The ceremonial use of architecture further strengthened this propaganda effort, as coronations, weddings, and funerals staged within monumental settings transformed stone into spectacle, with the soaring vaults of cathedrals amplifying the majesty of ritual, the echoing acoustics turning spoken oaths into divine pronouncements, and the visual harmony of architectural detail blending seamlessly with banners, costumes, and music to create immersive experiences in which power was not only proclaimed, but felt as though the very building itself confirmed the sacred nature of monarchy. What Henry VII achieved through this architectural program was more than mere beautification. He wove a narrative of permanence into a reign that was in fact precarious building structures that told stories of unity, continuity, and divine blessing, so that even long after his death, the stone vaults of Westminster and the heraldic carvings of palaces would continue to proclaim the legitimacy of the Tudor line, ensuring that his successors inherited not only a throne, but a built environment already saturated with propaganda, already whispering into the eyes and hearts of those who walked among its arches and aisles. In this sense, architecture became Henry's most enduring propaganda tool, for while ceremonies faded and portraits could be reinterpreted, the monumental presence of chapels, palaces, and civic works anchored his dynasty in the physical and cultural landscape of England, offering a legitimacy that was harder to challenge, precisely because it seemed to rise naturally from the very stones of the kingdom, and thus through architecture, Henry VII transformed fragility into permanence, uncertainty into monumentality, and the contested origins of his rule into the foundations of an image that still defines the Tudor dynasty's beginning. Part 3. The marriage portrait as diplomacy. In the Tudor world, where dynastic alliances were secured not merely by treaties, but by the exchange of brides and the uniting of bloodlines, the marriage portrait emerged as a powerful diplomatic weapon, serving as both a promise and a performance, a painted envoy that carried across borders the carefully constructed image of a prospective queen or king, transforming private negotiations into public spectacle and giving visual form to the political hopes of monarchs who understood that a likeness could seal trust, inspire desire, or convey majesty in ways words alone could not. And it is within this context that the Tudors elevated portraiture from an art of likeness into a tool of statecraft, ensuring that every detail, the pose, the clothing, the symbols, communicated legitimacy, wealth, and power to foreign courts as decisively as any ambassador's speech. Henry VII, ever cautious and calculating, pioneered this practice in his search for dynastic security through foreign marriage. For when he arranged the union of his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand, and Isabella of Spain, the portrait became a silent negotiator, reassuring the Spanish monarchs that their daughter was destined not for an unstable throne, but for a dynasty that cloaked itself in majesty and permanence, and Catherine herself was depicted in images that emphasized piety, chastity, and regal bearing her. Likeness designed to reassure the English court that she embodied not merely beauty, but the virtues expected of a consort who would secure the future of the line. The circulation of marriage portraits often served as the first encounter between prospective spouses who had never met in person, and thus the image had to perform with almost theatrical precision, balancing the need to flatter with the imperative to remain recognizably accurate. For if the likeness diverged too much from reality, disappointment could sour diplomacy. Yet if it failed to flatter, negotiations might collapse altogether. And the Tudors, aware of this delicate balance, employed artists who mastered the art of idealized realism, ensuring that portraits presented a polished yet credible vision of the royal subject, one that could sustain the weight of political expectation. The marriage portrait also allowed the Tudors to project power outward, for when images of princesses or princes traveled across Europe, they acted as ambassadors of the dynasty's stability and splendor, reminding foreign courts that England, though an island kingdom, was fully engaged in the networks of European politics, and every jewel-embroidered gown or richly painted background spoke not only of personal wealth, but of national prestige, persuading others that alliance with the Tudors was a bond with prosperity itself. Henry VIII inherited and expanded this use of portraiture, for his quest for dynastic succession made marriage negotiations a recurring theme of his reign, and each time the prospect of union arose, whether with Catherine of Aragon, Anne of Cleves, or other candidates, the portrait became a central instrument of diplomacy, sometimes with disastrous consequences, as in the case of Anne of Cleves, whose likeness by Hans Holbein presented her as dignified and attractive, only for Henry to reject her upon meeting her in person, revealing the precarious power of image-making, where propaganda could not always withstand the reality of human encounter. Yet even in this infamous failure, the marriage portrait illustrates its role in Tudor propaganda, for the fact that Henry blamed the portrait rather than his own expectations underscores how seriously likenesses were treated, as if the painted image itself bore responsibility for diplomatic disappointment. And this speaks to the near magical authority invested in such images, which were expected not only to depict, but to perform, to embody dynastic hopes in pigment and panel. The Tudors also understood the broader theatricality of marriage diplomacy, for portraits were often unveiled in ceremonies that framed the image as a revelation of beauty and virtue, displayed before ambassadors, courtiers, and foreign envoys in settings designed to magnify their impact. And these unveilings became political theatre, where the first gaze upon a portrait was as carefully managed as the first handshake in a treaty, reinforcing the idea that the visual encounter was itself a binding act of diplomacy. Beyond their immediate function in negotiations, marriage portraits also endured as permanent records of dynastic union. For once a marriage was secured, the portrait of the queen consort became a visual emblem of alliance, reminding subjects of the international bond their monarch had forged. And when Catherine of Aragon was painted alongside Arthur and later Henry, her image signaled not merely her personal role, but the fusion of English and Spanish interests, an enduring advertisement of Anglo-Spanish unity that could be invoked in pageantry, processions, and household decoration. The symbolism embedded in these portraits was as important as the likeness itself. For a clasped pendant might symbolize union, a background landscape might suggest fertility, a book might imply learning or piety, and each choice was deliberate, crafted to project the virtues most valued by the intended audience, whether that was a foreign monarch, a skeptical court faction, or the broader population who would come to identify the consort with the symbols displayed in her official likeness. And thus, the portrait was not merely descriptive, but prescriptive, shaping how the subject was to be perceived long before she arrived at her new court. The circulation of these images also reveals the globalizing networks of Tudor propaganda, for as painters, diplomats, and merchants carried portraits across seas and borders, the image of the Tudor dynasty spread into Europe's cultural bloodstream, reinforcing England's presence in continental affairs and ensuring that even distant courts had a vision of Tudor magnificence. And this international dimension underscores how propaganda operated not only domestically, but on a pan-European stage where visual impressions could influence alliances, rivalries, and perceptions of power in ways as consequential as armies or treasuries. In the end, the marriage portrait was more than a likeness. It was a tool of persuasion, a silent negotiator, and a portable theatre of dynastic ambition, shaping the course of Tudor diplomacy and embedding the dynasty's image in the imagination of foreign courts. And its power lay precisely in its dual nature. For while it appeared to be a mere picture of a man or woman, it was in truth a canvas saturated with political meaning, every brushstroke carrying the weight of legitimacy, desire, and alliance, making marriage portraits not only records of union, but instruments of power in the larger game of Tudor image-making. Part 4. Henry VIII and the Cult of Majesty. Henry VIII transformed royal image-making into something unprecedented in England, elevating the monarch's personal likeness into a spectacle of grandeur that defined kingship itself. For while his father, Henry VII, had leaned heavily on architecture and symbols to buttress fragile legitimacy, Henry VIII, secure in his inheritance and bursting with ambition, projected majesty through his own body appearance and presence, crafting a cult of monarchy in which the king's image was both awe-inspiring and unavoidable. A carefully engineered display that sought to overwhelm subjects with the sheer magnificence of his authority, and this transformation marked a turning point in Tudor propaganda, where the individual ruler became the central stage upon which power was performed. The most iconic example of this cult of majesty is the portraiture commissioned by Henry, particularly those by Hans Holbein the Younger, who created a template of kingly power that would dominate perceptions for centuries. For in the colossal wall painting of Whitehall Palace and in copies derived from it, Henry stands front-facing, legs apart, hands on hips, gazing directly at the viewer with a posture that radiates strength, confidence and command, a radical departure from the more passive, profile depictions of earlier monarchs. And in this stance, Henry announced himself not merely as a ruler by lineage, but as a force of nature, a body politic incarnate, whose very presence communicated domination and control. The details of these portraits were no less propagandistic than the pose itself. For Holbein and other court painters adorned Henry with sumptuous fabrics, jewel-encrusted doublets, and symbols of martial prowess, making his body a canvas upon which wealth, power, and fertility were displayed. And the scale of the paintings, larger than life, reinforced the impression of a king who towered over his court and subjects alike, so that even those who never glimpsed him in person could feel his imposing aura through painted likenesses circulated in noble households and foreign courts. Yet portraiture was only one dimension of Henry's cult of majesty, for his physical appearances at court in tournaments and in progresses became theatrical displays, where his body itself was the propaganda. As he rode through London in glittering armor, jousted before cheering crowds, or processed into cathedrals under cloths of gold, each public moment choreographed to magnify his majesty. And in these spectacles, Henry embodied the medieval ideal of the warrior king while simultaneously aligning with Renaissance notions of the princely ruler, blending chivalric tradition with modern grandeur in a way that left indelible impressions on those who witnessed him. Clothing played an especially vital role in this image-making, for Henry used fashion as an extension of his power, commissioning garments of extraordinary expense with furs, silks, and cloth of gold designed to dazzle and intimidate, and his wardrobe became a political statement, signaling not only his wealth, but his ability to command resources on a scale that few could rival. And when he appeared in public resplendent in shimmering fabrics, he was not merely dressed but armored in majesty, each fold of fabric a declaration of supremacy. Music and pageantry amplified this cult of presence, for Henry was not only a king but also a performer, known for his skill in music, dance, and spectacle. And by presenting himself as both patron and participant in the arts, he drew his court into a world where the king's charisma was the center of gravity, ensuring that cultural life itself revolved around his magnificence. And these performances served propaganda ends by projecting Henry as not only mighty but cultured, not only a warrior but a prince of Renaissance refinement. The cult of majesty extended to coinage and seals, where Henry's profile was rendered in increasingly assertive fashion, his features broad and commanding, his crown prominently displayed, his inscriptions emphasizing sovereignty, so that even in the smallest token of daily exchange, subjects encountered the commanding visage of their monarch, a reminder that every economic act was stamped with his authority. And this saturation of imagery in all aspects of life created a sense that Henry was omnipresent, his majesty inescapable. Yet what made Henry's cult of majesty truly distinctive was its adaptability, for he used his image to respond to changing political needs, projecting youthful vigor in his early reign, virile fertility during his quest for heirs, martial defiance in the face of European rivals, and later patriarchal authority as head of the English Church, so that his portraits, appearances and symbols evolved in tandem with his political narrative, allowing the image to mask weaknesses and amplify strengths, transforming propaganda into a living, shifting performance of monarchy. This adaptability was most striking in the wake of the break with Rome, when Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, for at that moment his cult of majesty took on a sacred dimension, casting the king not only as secular ruler, but as spiritual leader, and imagery reinforced this fusion, with depictions of Henry enthroned in majesty, surrounded by biblical parallels, architecture inscribed with his titles, and pageantry that blurred the boundaries between religious and royal ceremony, ensuring that obedience to the king was inseparable from obedience to God, and thus the cult of majesty became both political and theological propaganda. Even in his declining years, when obesity and illness limited his mobility, the cult of majesty sustained his authority. For the visual language of grandeur could conceal physical frailty, and portraits continued to present him as robust and commanding, the reality of a faltering body hidden behind the permanence of painted majesty, ensuring that the myth of Henry as unassailable monarch endured long after his strength waned, a testament to the power of propaganda to construct an image greater than the man himself. In the end, Henry VIII's cultivation of majesty was not simply vanity, but deliberate politics, for by turning himself into an icon of kingship, he redefined what it meant to rule in England, ensuring that his personal image became the embodiment of the state. And this cult of majesty, rooted in portraiture, spectacle and symbolism, not only secured his authority during his turbulent reign, but also established a model of image-making that his daughter Elizabeth would later perfect, proving that in the Tudor world, to be seen was to rule, and to control the image was to command reality itself. Part 5. The Pageantry of Royal Power. The Tudors understood instinctively that power was not only exercised in councils or codified in law, but staged before the eyes of the people, and thus pageantry became a central medium of propaganda, transforming public ritual into a theatre of monarchy where magnificence, wealth and authority were displayed in dazzling abundance, binding subjects to their rulers through awe and emotional spectacle. And in this sense, every coronation procession, tournament and civic entry was not merely entertainment, but a carefully orchestrated performance designed to reinforce Tudor rule, weaving loyalty into the very fabric of communal experience. From the earliest years of the dynasty, pageantry was deployed to dramatize legitimacy, as when Henry VII made his ceremonial entry into London after Bosworth, greeted by elaborate triumphal arches erected by the city's guilds, allegorical figures presenting him as a bringer of peace and banners emblazoned with the Tudor rose, turning the streets themselves into a stage where subjects encountered not a contested claimant, but a triumphant monarch whose arrival signaled divine order restored. And this tradition of staged magnificence expanded dramatically under his son, Henry VIII, who elevated pageantry into one of the most dazzling expressions of royal propaganda Europe had ever seen. The tournaments of Henry VIII in particular reveal how spectacle could become propaganda, for the jousts and tilts he staged at Greenwich or Richmond were not merely martial contests, but choreographed dramas in which the king appeared in resplendent armor, his pavilion draped with emblems of power, his horse caparisoned with symbols of fertility and victory, and when he charged into the lists, thousands of onlookers witnessed not just sport, but the enactment of a king's valor, a living demonstration that their ruler was the embodiment of knightly virtue and martial supremacy. And the thunder of hooves, the glitter of lances, and the cries of heralds created a sensory experience that etched loyalty into memory. Court masks and allegorical performances also played a key role, blending classical mythology with Tudor symbolism to elevate the monarch into a near-divine figure. For in these elaborate entertainments staged at banquets or civic receptions, courtiers dressed as gods, virtues, or heroes enacted scenes that always culminated in the glorification of the ruler, whether presenting the king as the sun that nourished the realm or the queen as the embodiment of chastity and wisdom. And these spectacles were both intimate and public, shaping elite perceptions, while rippling outward through gossip-printed descriptions and visual echoes, ensuring that the message of royal magnificence extended beyond those present in the hall. Civic entries into cities were among the most potent forms of pageantry. For when a monarch visited a town, the entire urban landscape was transformed into a stage of loyalty, with streets hung with tapestries, triumphal arches erected with Latin mottos, and allegorical tableaux and guilds presenting performances that cast the ruler as liberator, protector, and bringer of prosperity. And the ritual exchange of keys to the city symbolized submission and trust, while the monarch's gracious reception of these tokens dramatized benevolence, creating a cycle of obligation and gratitude that tied the community to the crown through shared performance. Religious pageantry also reinforced propaganda, especially in the early 16th century, before the break with Rome, when processions of saints' relics, Corpus Christi celebrations, and royal attendance at great liturgical feasts linked the monarchy to the sacred rhythms of the church, embedding the ruler's presence in divine spectacle. And even after Henry VIII's Reformation, the crown adapted religious pageantry to new purposes, staging processions that emphasized the monarch's headship of the English church, with banners, hymns, and symbols reshaped to proclaim that divine favor now flowed directly through the king, turning what had once been Catholic ritual into national theatre of obedience to Tudor supremacy. The Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520 offers perhaps the most extravagant example of pageantry as propaganda, for in this meeting between Henry VIII and Francis I of France, temporary palaces were constructed of cloth of gold, fountains poured with wine, tournaments dazzled onlookers, and feasts displayed unprecedented magnificence, all carefully designed to project the wealth and glory of the English crown to a continental audience. And though politically the summit achieved little, its visual impact was immense, imprinting in the minds of both English and French observers the idea of Henry as a ruler whose majesty could rival that of any monarch in Europe, proving that pageantry itself could serve as a form of diplomatic muscle flexing. Pageantry also functioned as a medium of propaganda in moments of crisis, for when legitimacy or authority wavered, spectacle could be used to restore confidence, as in the elaborate coronation of Anne Boleyn, where London was filled with allegorical displays, casting her as fertility, spring, and hope for the dynasty, even as many subjects murmured doubts about the break with Rome. And in such moments, pageantry sought to overwrite uncertainty with magnificence, giving visual form to the regime's narrative, even when it was contested. Importantly, pageantry was not limited to London or the royal court, but extended into the provinces through royal progresses, where the monarch's arrival in towns and villages became an occasion for local elites to stage performances, erect temporary triumphal structures, and offer symbolic gifts, all of which reinforced the reciprocal relationship between crown and subjects, for the people gave loyalty through performance, while the monarch bestowed favor through gracious acceptance. And these encounters ensured that even those far from the capital experienced the theatre of royal power firsthand. The sensory intensity of Tudor pageantry, its noise, colour, motion and spectacle, made it one of the most effective propaganda tools of the dynasty, for it reached across literacy divides, uniting nobles and commoners in shared experience, and because it was ephemeral, living only in the moment, it carried an emotional force that written proclamations or painted portraits could not match, creating memories that bound communities to the monarchy through the collective awe of having seen and heard magnificence. In the final analysis, Tudor pageantry was propaganda embodied in performance, a fusion of art, theatre and ritual that transformed monarchy into a lived experience. And by filling streets, fields and halls with spectacle, the Tudors ensured that their power was not only respected, but felt seared into the imagination through the sensory drama of pageantry, and this strategy, perfected under Henry VIII, would continue to shape the dynasty's use of image, proving that in the world of the Tudors, to rule was to perform, and to perform magnificently was to make power unforgettable. Part 6. Symbols of continuity and authority. For the Tudors, symbols were more than decorative motifs. They were instruments of persuasion, designed to condense complex political messages into instantly recognizable forms, and through heraldry, emblems, mottos, and repeated visual cues, the dynasty cultivated a language of continuity and authority that became embedded in the everyday life of the realm, ensuring that even those who never saw the monarch in person still encountered the presence of Tudor power through the symbols etched into buildings, coins, manuscripts and clothing. And this symbolic strategy was essential for a dynasty that began with fragile claims and needed to project permanence by embedding its identity into the cultural and visual fabric of England. Chief among these emblems was the Tudor rose, perhaps the most successful piece of political branding in English history, for by combining the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, the dynasty created a symbol that proclaimed reconciliation and unity after decades of civil conflict. And by stamping this rose onto coins, embroidering it into royal garments, carving it into stonework, and weaving it into tapestries, the Tudors saturated their kingdom with a visual shorthand that assured subjects that division was over, peace had been restored, and the crown now embodied harmony, so that every time a subject glimpsed the emblem, they were reminded of the narrative of unity that sustained Tudor legitimacy. Alongside the rose, the portcullis became a recurring emblem of Tudor authority, adopted from Henry VII's Beaufort lineage, and it carried powerful connotations of security, fortification, and dynastic strength, appearing on badges, official documents, and architectural decoration, symbolizing that the crown was a gatekeeper safeguarding the realm. And this repeated imagery was not accidental, but calculated, for by embedding symbols of defense and continuity into the monarchy's visual vocabulary, the Tudors projected the sense that their rule was as unyielding as the stone towers of their castles. Heraldry more broadly served as one of the most effective vehicles of propaganda, for through coats of arms, crests and devices, the Tudors communicated legitimacy, lineage and authority in visual codes instantly understood by contemporaries. And each marriage, alliance or dynastic claim was expressed heraldically, with shields quartered to display ancestral connections and legitimacy, transforming abstract genealogies into bold, colorful designs that could be displayed in churches, palaces, and civic spaces, turning walls and banners into silent arguments for the rightness of Tudor rule. Mottos, too, became integral to this symbolic language, for words paired with images reinforced the dynasty's authority, as in Henry VII's motto, Dieu est mon droit, God and my right, which linked kingship directly to divine sanction, or Elizabethan's use of semper idem, always the same, which emphasized constancy and reliability, and these short, memorable phrases, repeated on coins, documents, and public displays, functioned as verbal symbols, reinforcing the idea that the Tudors' authority was unchanging, God-given, and eternal. Religious symbols further magnified this projection of continuity, particularly in the reign of Henry VIII, when the break with Rome required a rebranding of sacred authority, and the king's imagery adopted iconographic elements traditionally associated with saints or Christ himself, subtly suggesting that royal authority was now a spiritual as well as temporal force. And this appropriation of religious symbolism gave the monarchy an aura of sacred inviolability, embedding the idea that loyalty to the monarch was inseparable from loyalty to God. The crown and scepter, long-standing emblems of English kingship, were also deliberately emphasized in Tudor visual culture, appearing not only in coronation regalia, but in portraits, pageantry, and official seals, with their repeated appearance reinforcing the timelessness of monarchy. And by highlighting these objects in paintings and ceremonies, the Tudors tied their rule to centuries of tradition, making their relatively new dynasty seem like the continuation of an ancient order rather than a break in lineage. And this visual continuity strengthened the perception of legitimacy. Clothing and jewelry provided yet another canvas for symbols, with monarchs and courtiers wearing embroidered emblems, jeweled roses, or pendants displaying dynastic devices, turning the royal body and the bodies of the elite into moving billboards for Tudor imagery. And when the Queen wore a necklace bearing a Tudor rose, or the King a jeweled portcullis, they were not merely adorned, but enveloped in propaganda, their very persons embodying the dynasty's narrative through visible signs that radiated meaning to all who looked upon them. Architecture, too, was saturated with symbols, from the stone roses carved into Westminster Abbey as Henry VII chapel, to the repeated portcullises adorning gateways and ceilings. And these details, often unnoticed consciously by passers-by, nonetheless created an environment in which the monarchy's symbols were omnipresent, naturalizing Tudor rule by embedding its imagery into the physical world of churches, palaces, and civic spaces, so that to live in Tudor England was to inhabit a landscape branded with dynastic identity. The repetition of these symbols across multiple media was what made them so effective. For propaganda succeeds not by novelty, but by saturation. And the Tudors understood that seeing the rose, portcullis, or royal arms again and again would ingrain them into the minds of subjects until they seemed inseparable from the very concept of monarchy. And thus, the consistency of symbolic messaging was crucial, ensuring that whether one saw a coin, a tapestry, a doorway, or a manuscript, the same emblems reinforced the same story of unity, continuity, and divine authority. These symbols also traveled abroad, carried in diplomatic gifts, letters, and architectural details of embassies, so that foreign courts too were reminded of Tudor identity. And in this way, the rose and other emblems became not only domestic propaganda, but tools of international branding, presenting England as a stable, united monarchy worthy of alliance and respect. And the persistence of these emblems in heraldic collections and diplomatic records shows how deeply they were woven into the projection of Tudor power across Europe. Ultimately, the Tudors' mastery of symbols demonstrates the power of visual shorthand in politics, for by distilling authority into roses, portcullises, crowns, and mottos, they created a language of legitimacy that could be read instantly by anyone, literate or illiterate, elite or commoner, domestic subject or foreign ally. And in this symbolic universe, continuity was never left to chance but manufactured through repetition, saturation, and consistency, ensuring that the dynasty's fragile beginnings were overshadowed by the overwhelming presence of emblems that made Tudor rule appear inevitable, eternal, and ordained. Part 7. The spread of printed images. The invention and spread of the printing press in late 15th century Europe transformed communication, And under the Tudors, this technology became a vital tool for extending propaganda beyond the confines of palaces and pageantry into the hands and homes of a wider population. For where once imagery had been confined to the slow work of manuscript illumination, painted banners or sculpted stone, print now allowed the rapid reproduction of woodcuts, engravings, and pamphlets that could multiply the monarch's image and symbolic authority across towns and villages with unprecedented speed, ensuring that the face of the king or queen, their emblems or their messages could be encountered by audiences who would never step inside the royal court. The earliest Tudor monarch to exploit this was Henry VII, whose fragile claim required constant reinforcement and printed badges, genealogical charts, and proclamations circulated under his reign, serving to remind subjects of the legitimacy of his line. But it was under Henry VIII that the full potential of printed images as propaganda became clear. For as religious change swept through England, the monarch's ability to command the press became a decisive weapon in shaping opinion, with woodcut portraits of the king appearing in official proclamations, books, and religious tracts, so that Henry's face and authority became inseparably linked to the Reformed Church. And this visual repetition of his image in print naturalized the idea of royal supremacy over religion. Woodcut illustrations became one of the most effective means of broadcasting royal imagery because, unlike expensive paintings or tapestries which only elites could access, woodcuts could be reproduced cheaply and bound into books or sold as single sheets. And printers quickly realized that the market for images of the monarch was lucrative, while the crown understood that controlling this market meant shaping the messages subjects consumed. So licensing systems and state oversight ensured that approved images of the monarch dominated the presses, while critical or unauthorized depictions were suppressed. Reinforcing a carefully curated visual presence, during the dissolution of the monasteries, printed propaganda flourished with woodcuts contrasting corrupt monks with a just and godly king, shaping public perception of the Reformation as a moral crusade, and these images worked as visual arguments instantly comprehensible to the illiterate, who could not read the accompanying text but could see vice caricatured in grotesque monks and virtue embodied in regal authority, showing how print bridged the gap between literate elites and a largely oral visual culture, embedding Tudor messages at multiple social levels. Elizabeth I would later refine this art of printed propaganda even further, for her reign coincided with an explosion in pamphleteering and illustrated books, and though the Queen famously controlled her painted portraits through the system of approved patterns, she also ensured that printed versions of her likeness circulated in small engravings, frontispieces, and emblem books, reinforcing her presence across a wider audience. And in this way, the Virgin Queen's face appeared not only in great painted masterpieces, but in the modest printed images sold or gifted throughout the realm, making her a familiar figure in both noble households and merchant shops. Manas, pamphlets, and broadsheets extended propaganda beyond mere likeness, for they became platforms to communicate narratives of victories, celebrations, or warnings, and printers often decorated such texts with elaborate borders filled with Tudor roses, royal coats of arms, or allegorical figures representing justice and peace, thereby weaving the monarchy's emblems into everyday reading materials. So that even when subjects consumed a story about a military campaign or a royal decree, they also consumed an artistic framework saturated with Tudor symbolism, blurring the line between information and propaganda. The rise of literacy among the gentry and urban middle classes meant that printed propaganda could appeal not only to the eyes, but to the intellect, combining rhetorical argument with imagery, and the Tudors made deliberate use of this synergy, commissioning pamphlets that justified religious and political change, adorned with visual cues that elevated the message, so that words and images worked in tandem to persuade, entertain, and command, amplifying the monarch's voice in ways oral proclamation alone could not. Controlling print was crucial, and the Stationers' Company, granted a royal charter in 1557, became a mechanism through which the Crown could regulate what was published, ensuring that unauthorized or seditious images did not undermine the monarchy's authority. And this control demonstrates that the Tudors recognized the immense power of printed imagery, for censorship was not only about suppressing dissent, but about preserving the monopoly of royal representation so that the only face of monarchy in circulation was the one officially sanctioned. Beyond England's borders, printed imagery became a diplomatic tool, for engravings of monarchs could be sent abroad as gifts or exchanged among courts, shaping foreign perceptions of Tudor power. And in the competitive environment of Renaissance Europe, where image mattered as much as armies, the ability to broadcast likenesses through prints ensured that the Tudors were represented in ways that projected strength, magnificence, and authority, rivaling the visual strategies of Habsburgs, Valois, and Medici. The legacy of printed propaganda also reveals how deeply it embedded monarchs into the popular imagination, for cheap woodcuts of Henry VIII or Elizabeth I circulated long after their reigns, shaping how they were remembered by later generations. And even today, the familiar bearded face of Henry VIII in profile owes much to its repeated reproduction in print, rather than the few surviving original paintings, showing that print was not just a tool of immediate propaganda, but a medium that fixed dynastic imagery into collective memory. By the end of the Tudor era, printed images had become an indispensable part of governance, extending royal presence far beyond what personal appearances or grand pageants could achieve. And while pageantry dazzled audiences in specific places and moments, print made propaganda portable, reproducible, and enduring, ensuring that the image of the monarch could be seen, carried, read, and remembered by subjects across the realm, embedding the Tudor dynasty not only in the architecture of palaces and cathedrals, but in the very fabric of books, broadsheets, and engravings that circulated through towns, villages, and marketplaces. In this way, the Tudors demonstrated an acute awareness of the modern truth that political power depends not only on swords and laws, but on the ability to control images and narratives, and by mastering the printed medium, they expanded their propaganda apparatus into every corner of the kingdom, ensuring that their dynasty was not only seen, but imagined, not only obeyed, but remembered. And thus, the spread of printed images marks a decisive moment in the evolution of monarchical power through visual culture. Part 8. Royal progresses as political theatre. Royal progresses were among the most visible forms of Tudor propaganda, turning the monarch's movement across the realm into carefully choreographed spectacles of power, loyalty, and pageantry. And while progresses were not unique to the Tudors, they perfected the practice into a political theatre that brought the court's magnificence into direct contact with subjects, allowing local communities to see, hear, and participate in the monarchy's grand narrative, so that the king or queen's presence was not confined to London or royal palaces, but woven into the very geography of England. These progresses were not casual journeys, but deliberate performances often planned months in advance, with routes chosen to reward loyal subjects, impress doubtful regions, or demonstrate authority after political upheavals, and every stop along the way became an opportunity for propaganda as towns prepared triumphal arches, speeches, plays, and feasts, each event saturated with symbols, allegories, and imagery that reinforced the monarch's authority, while the monarch's very presence lent these displays a sense of sacred immediacy. For Henry VII, progresses were a way to assert control after Bosworth, ensuring that regions that had supported Yorkist rivals witnessed firsthand the legitimacy and magnificence of the new dynasty, and his progress through the Midlands and northern counties after his accession allowed him to project stability, blending ceremonial displays with judicial sessions to demonstrate that royal justice had arrived in person, creating a powerful association between the physical presence of the monarch and the restoration of peace and order. Henry VIII expanded progresses into grand demonstrations of wealth and majesty, with his court traveling like a moving palace, carrying tapestries, plate and furnishings to transform temporary lodgings into splendid stages of magnificence. And wherever he went, his subjects encountered not only their king, but the overwhelming material display of Tudor prosperity, reinforcing the idea that his authority was matched by resources and magnificence. And this projection of grandeur was propaganda in motion, a living portrait that dwarfed subjects with its scale and spectacle. The break with Rome and the assertion of royal supremacy made progresses even more politically significant, for when Henry VIII or Edward VI journeyed through the realm, the pageants staged in their honor often included allegories of true religion, depictions of monarchy as a new Moses or David, and displays of royal arms alongside biblical verses, binding the monarch's physical journey to the spiritual journey of the nation, and embedding the Reformation into the theatre of royal movement. Elizabeth elevated the art of the progress into a signature feature of her reign, for as the unmarried virgin queen with no heir, her physical presence was essential in maintaining loyalty and projecting constancy, and her progresses became opportunities for local elites to demonstrate devotion while receiving the honor of hosting their monarch, with houses like Kenilworth and Elvetham transformed into stages of elaborate entertainments that blended myth, allegory and flattery, portraying Elizabeth as Astrea, the goddess of justice, or Gloriana, the eternal ruler, images that reinforced her unique authority and cultivated the cult of the Virgin Queen. These entertainments were propaganda partnerships, for local hosts spent immense sums to impress their queen, but the messages they crafted also reinforced the national narrative, with rivers staged to run with wine actors delivering speeches that praised Elizabeth's wisdom and chastity, and mechanical marvels displaying abundance, all designed to present her reign as a golden age, while the Queen's gracious acceptance of such tributes further magnified her charisma, making subjects feel that they had participated in shaping her myth. For common people, progresses were often the only chance to see their monarch in person, and this visibility was itself propaganda, for even the briefest glimpse of a passing cavalcade, richly dressed courtiers, and the glittering queen riding beneath a canopy could leave a lasting impression of majesty and magnificence. And these fleeting encounters were reinforced by the stories, songs, and accounts that circulated afterward, extending the propaganda impact beyond those who directly witnessed the spectacle. Progresses also had a political geography, with monarchs using them to reward loyalty or to shore up authority in potentially disloyal regions, so that presence itself became a weapon of control. For by appearing in person, the monarch reminded subjects of their obligations, reassured allies, and warned potential rebels of the crown's reach. And this strategic use of travel shows how propaganda was not only about images or texts, but about movement and physical performance across the land. The logistical scale of progresses reinforced their significance, for the arrival of hundreds of courtiers, servants and guards turned towns into temporary capitals, overwhelming local resources, but also flooding them with the pageantry of monarchy. And this disruption was part of the message, reminding subjects that their towns and villages were part of a larger national body bound together by the presence of the sovereign, and that local identity was subsumed under the grandeur of the crown. Foreign ambassadors often reported on progresses, noting the Queen's ability to win popular affection through her journeys, and these accounts reveal how progresses also had an international propaganda function, for by demonstrating a monarch beloved by her people and welcomed with triumphal pageantry, the Tudors projected an image of stability and strength abroad, countering narratives of internal division or weakness, and using the very landscape of England as a stage for international display. What made Tudor progresses so effective as propaganda was their fusion of multiple media, architecture, performance, speech, music, and allegory, into one immersive experience where the monarch was both spectator and central actor, and the audience was not passive but participatory, contributing to the spectacle through loyalty, expense, and performance, making propaganda not something imposed from above, but a shared ritual that bound ruler and ruled in a theatrical compact of devotion and magnificence. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, progresses had become legendary events, remembered not only for their extravagance, but for the way they embodied the union of monarch and people in shared pageantry. And though later monarchs would continue the practice, none matched the Tudors' skill at transforming travel into propaganda, using every mile, every speech, and every performance to project unity, loyalty, and magnificence, so that the very roads of England seemed to carry the echoes of royal authority wherever the court passed. Thus, royal progresses stand as one of the clearest demonstrations of Tudor mastery of propaganda, turning the act of movement itself into political theatre, where every encounter was scripted, every symbol chosen, and every performance calculated to reinforce the monarchy's image, ensuring that the dynasty was not only seen in its capital, but inscribed across the entire kingdom through living, breathing, moving displays of power. Part 9. Religious Iconography and Reformation. Religion was the most potent arena of Tudor propaganda, for in an age when sacred images adorned churches, guided devotion, and structured daily life, the ability to control and redefine religious iconography meant controlling not only what people saw, but how they understood their relationship to God and authority. And during the Reformation, this manipulation of imagery became one of the sharpest tools by which the Tudors reshaped England's spiritual and political identity. In the early years of Henry VIII's reign, traditional Catholic imagery flourished, with saints, relics, and devotional art continuing the medieval legacy. But once the break with Rome was enacted, the monarchy confronted the immense challenge of persuading a population steeped in centuries of Catholic iconography that new forms of worship and authority were legitimate, and images became the battlefield where these rival claims were contested. The most dramatic transformation came with the suppression of monasteries, where not only lands and wealth were confiscated, but religious images were stripped, defaced, or destroyed, a campaign of iconoclasm that carried powerful propaganda value. For by toppling statues of saints and removing papal symbols, the crown signaled that old allegiances were broken, and that loyalty now lay with a monarch who embodied both temporal and spiritual authority, so that the very emptiness of church walls became a visual declaration of royal supremacy. Yet the Tudors did not reject imagery altogether. Rather, they reoriented it, substituting the monarch for the pope or saint, so that woodcuts of Henry VIII depicted him as Moses receiving divine law or as Solomon embodying wisdom, while royal coats of arms replaced papal insignia in churches and prayer books, transforming sacred spaces into stages of dynastic legitimacy. And in this way, subjects absorbed the message that the king was God's chosen governor on earth. Printed Bibles, most famously, the Great Bible of 1539, carried frontispieces that dramatized this new religious order, with images of Henry VIII enthroned at the center, receiving the word of God directly and passing it to clergy and subjects. A powerful visual that condensed the entire theology of royal supremacy into a single striking image, showing the monarch as the conduit of divine truth. And such images placed in parish churches for public reading became unavoidable propaganda for the new religious settlement. Under Edward VI, iconoclasm intensified with injunctions ordering the removal of images, stained glass, and altars, and this destruction itself functioned as propaganda, visually marking a break with the past and dramatizing the purity of Reformed worship, while at the same time new imagery appeared in the form of Protestant woodcuts emphasizing scripture, preaching and the simplicity of the word, reinforcing a new visual culture where the absence of saints was itself a message of loyalty to truth and crown. Mary I reversed this course dramatically, seeking to restore Catholic imagery, processions and sacred art as part of her campaign to reassert papal authority, and under her reign, churches once again displayed statues and altarpieces, while woodcuts and polemics depicted her as a Catholic savior, but the brevity of her reign meant that this restoration was uneven, and the violent persecution of Protestants produced counter-narratives in which Protestant writers portrayed her imagery as empty idolatry, so that religious iconography became not only a reflection of policy, but a contested propaganda battlefield in which rival visions of monarchy clashed. Elizabeth I charted a careful middle course, recognizing the enduring power of imagery while avoiding the excesses of both iconoclasm and Catholic veneration. And her settlement deliberately restricted religious imagery in churches while elevating her own person as the central visual symbol of unity, so that instead of saints, it was Elizabeth herself who became the focus of quasi-sacred imagery. Portrayed as the Virgin Queen, a Protestant icon whose chastity and constancy replaced the cult of the Virgin Mary, and in portraits, medals and pageants, her image fused the sacred with the political, making loyalty to Queen and faith indistinguishable. The Queen's coronation in 1559 exemplified this reorientation, as pageants in the streets of London blended biblical allegories with Protestant virtues, depicting Elizabeth as Deborah or Judith, heroines of the Old Testament who defended true religion. And such imagery broadcast the message that the new order was divinely ordained, while simultaneously avoiding overtly Catholic symbolism, crafting a new visual language of sacred monarchy appropriate to a Protestant realm. Religious iconography also shaped international propaganda, as engravings of Elizabeth circulated abroad, presenting her as the Protestant defender of Christendom, often juxtaposed with monstrous depictions of her Catholic enemies, so that religious imagery became a diplomatic weapon, not only bolstering domestic loyalty, but shaping perceptions of England's role in the broader religious struggles of Europe, casting the Tudors as central actors in a cosmic struggle between truth and corruption. For ordinary people, these shifts in imagery profoundly altered their daily religious experience. For where once parish churches had been filled with saints' images, stained glass and processions, now they displayed royal arms, biblical texts and the occasional portrait of the sovereign. And this visual shift embedded the monarchy into the spiritual lives of subjects in ways that no sermon alone could achieve, making the Tudor dynasty inseparable from the way English men and women imagined the sacred. The propaganda power of this transformation lay in its persistence, for even when contested or resisted, the new iconography forced subjects to confront the reality of change, and by the time Elizabeth's reign ended, the association of monarchy with Protestant imagery had become deeply entrenched, ensuring that loyalty to crown and loyalty to Reformed religion were interwoven in the English consciousness. Ultimately, the manipulation of religious iconography during the Tudor Reformation reveals how propaganda was not only about portraits, pageants, or symbols of power, but about reshaping the very language of devotion, transforming saints into monarchs, papal insignia into royal arms, and altarpieces into royal frontispieces, so that every glance at a church wall or printed Bible reinforced the supremacy of the Tudor dynasty as both political and spiritual authority. And in this way, the Reformation became as much a visual revolution as a theological one. Part 10. Elizabeth I and the Masque of Virginity. Elizabeth I's reign represents one of the most remarkable examples of propaganda in Tudor history, for she transformed a potential liability, her unmarried status and lack of an heir, into a powerful myth that defined her monarchy, and by cultivating the image of herself as the Virgin Queen, she turned virginity into a political weapon, a religious symbol, and a national emblem, weaving chastity into the fabric of her authority so that what might have appeared as weakness instead became the source of unparalleled strength. From the outset of her reign in 1558, Elizabeth faced immense pressure to marry, with Parliament, foreign courts, and her own councillors urging her to secure the succession through a husband. Yet she resisted, and rather than framing this as indecision, she crafted it as divine destiny, portraying herself as wedded to her people, her virginity symbolizing devotion not to a man, but to the kingdom itself, a claim dramatized in her famous speech to Parliament, where she declared she had already married a husband, namely the Kingdom of England, a rhetorical flourish that was reinforced visually and ceremonially through her public image. Portraiture became the principal vehicle of this propaganda, with Elizabeth's image tightly controlled through the system of patterns, standardized likenesses distributed to court painters to ensure consistency, and these portraits emphasized not her naturalistic features, but her symbolic role, with her youthful face preserved across decades, her body concealed by elaborate gowns, and her image surrounded by symbols of purity, constancy, and eternity, so that Elizabeth was less a mortal woman than an icon whose appearance defied time, reinforcing the idea of eternal virginity. The Darnley portrait of the early reign established this template, with Elizabeth presented in restrained elegance, her body minimized while her face radiates authority, and later portraits such as the Armada portrait crystallized the Virgin Queen myth, showing Elizabeth's hand upon the globe, ships in the background signaling triumph over Spain, and her attire encrusted with pearls, symbols of chastity, so that every detail proclaimed her virginity as the source of England's strength and divine protection, and the nation's survival became visually tied to her personal myth. Pageantry reinforced these messages with civic entries and progresses, staging allegories of Elizabeth as Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice, whose return marked a golden age, or as Diana, the chaste huntress, whose purity safeguarded her realm, and these performances transformed her unmarried status into a theatrical advantage, allowing audiences to see their queen as not bound by human frailty, but elevated to a mythic plane, a living goddess whose virginity protected her subjects. Literature, too, participated in the propagation of the Virgin Queen, with poets such as Edmund Spenser weaving Elizabeth into allegories like the Fairy Queen, where she appears as Gloriana, the embodiment of beauty, virtue, and majesty, and these literary creations functioned as propaganda by embedding Elizabeth's image into the cultural imagination, so that readers encountered not only their queen, but a divine figure whose virginity was inseparable from her sovereignty, reinforcing her myth in the minds of both elites and commoners. Religious symbolism underpinned this cult of virginity, for in an England recently severed from the cult of the Virgin Mary, Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen filled a symbolic void, offering a Protestant equivalent that united notions of purity and protection with national identity and sermons prayers. And official rhetoric often likened her chastity to divine providence, suggesting that her very body was a vessel of God's will, chosen to defend the realm against Catholic enemies, thereby making her virginity not merely personal, but cosmic in significance. The political utility of this image was immense, for by remaining unmarried, Elizabeth avoided entangling herself with foreign princes who might have compromised her independence, while simultaneously denying English nobles the opportunity to divide the court through factional rivalries over marriage, and instead she presented herself as universally accessible yet unattainable, the beloved of her people rather than of any man, and this careful balance made her both distant and intimate, above ordinary politics yet embedded in the affections of her subjects. Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen also proved a potent weapon against Catholic rivals, particularly Mary, Queen of Scots, who was portrayed as a corrupt and immoral foil to Elizabeth's purity. And in the propaganda battle of the 1560s, 1580s, Elizabeth's virginity became a marker of divine favor, contrasted with Mary's scandalous marriages and alleged conspiracies, so that international observers were encouraged to see Elizabeth as a divinely protected Virgin Queen, standing against Catholic corruption, a symbol that resonated across Protestant Europe. The endurance of this propaganda relied on consistency, and Elizabeth ensured that her appearance in portraits remained youthful even into old age, with wrinkles, decay, and age erased, for the Virgin Queen could not be depicted as mortal, and this deliberate suspension of time elevated her image into a symbol of eternity, suggesting that her reign itself was perpetual, untouched by human decline, and thereby making her person the visual embodiment of political continuity in a realm fraught with uncertainty. Symbols of virginity permeated every aspect of her imagery. Pearls as emblems of purity, the moon associated with Diana, the chaste goddess, and even elaborate costumes that concealed her body, denying any suggestion of sexuality, while coronation robes, scepters, and crowns reinforced her fusion of chastity with majesty, so that Elizabeth's wardrobe itself became propaganda, each garment a canvas of symbolic power, radiating the message of purity and authority. This myth also reshaped gendered expectations of monarchy, for in a patriarchal age that doubted women's ability to rule, Elizabeth inverted weakness into strength, transforming her womanhood into a source of unique authority. For no king could claim virginity as a sacred sign, and thus she recast femininity not as a liability, but as a divine distinction that set her apart from all rulers before her, crafting a new model of sovereignty that blurred the line between earthly queen and celestial icon. The Virgin Queen myth endured far beyond Elizabeth, as death for poets, playwrights, and chroniclers continued to celebrate her chastity as the defining feature of her reign. And in popular memory, she became immortalized as the eternal queen, her virginity inseparable from the triumphs of the Armada, the flourishing of the arts, and the golden age of England, showing how propaganda once established could transcend its immediate purpose to shape national identity for generations. Ultimately, Elizabeth's Masque of Virginity stands as a masterclass in propaganda, for by controlling her image, manipulating symbols, and embracing allegory, she turned absence into presence, weakness into strength, and private circumstance into public mythology, making her body not simply her own, but the symbolic body of the realm. And in doing so, she ensured that her reign would be remembered not merely as political history, but as a carefully staged performance of eternal purity and divine authority. Part 11. Court Artists and the Manufacture of Splendor. Behind every portrait, pageant, and emblem of Tudor propaganda stood the hands of artists whose work was not mere decoration, but a political tool for painters, sculptors, designers, and jewelers, crafted images that projected royal power and shaped how subjects, allies, and rivals perceived the monarchy and their labor turned symbols into reality, transforming visual language into the substance of sovereignty. The Tudor court became a magnet for foreign artists, particularly from the Low Countries and Germany, whose technical mastery in portraiture and printmaking allowed the dynasty to present itself with unprecedented refinement. And this influx reflected the political necessity of aligning English monarchs with continental sophistication. For to be taken seriously among Europe's great powers, the Tudors required not only armies and treaties, but also images that spoke the language of magnificence. Hans Holbein the Younger stands as the most celebrated of these figures. His arrival at Henry VIII's court in the 1530s, ushering in a new era of image-making, for Holbein's portraits captured not only likeness, but authority, presenting sitters with monumental dignity, and his rendering of Henry VIII in particular established the iconic template of the king as a colossal commanding figure, legs astride broad-shouldered and gaze unflinching, an image that became so powerful it survived even when the original mural was destroyed. Repeated endlessly in copies that ensured Henry's grandeur was permanently imprinted on the national imagination. Holbein's influence extended beyond painted panels to design, for he produced miniatures, jewels, book illustrations, and elaborate visual schemes for diplomatic gifts, embedding Tudor propaganda in objects that circulated across Europe, and his mastery showed how artistry could be weaponized to persuade, impress, and intimidate, making him not just a painter, but a strategist of image. Yet Holbein was only the beginning, for later reigns cultivated their own artistic figures, such as Nicholas Hilliard, whose delicate portrait miniatures of Elizabeth rendered the Queen as timeless and idealized, often erasing signs of age, and these tiny works, worn as jewels or given as favors, functioned as intimate instruments of propaganda, circulating among courtiers and foreign ambassadors to reinforce the myth of eternal youth and purity, demonstrating that even the smallest canvas could carry immense political weight. Costume designers and jewelers also played a vital role in constructing Tudor image, for the elaborate gowns, intricate embroidery, and dazzling ornaments worn by monarchs were themselves propaganda. Their sheer expense signaling wealth and stability, while their symbolic motifs, roses, suns, moons, and pearls, conveyed messages of dynastic legitimacy and divine favor, and the artisans who crafted these items worked under direct or indirect royal patronage, their creations ensuring that every appearance of the monarch was a stage-managed performance of splendor. Architects and set designers contributed through temporary structures built for pageants, coronations, and civic entries, constructing triumphal arches adorned with allegorical figures, artificial forests, and theatrical devices that transformed streets into stages. And while the monarch passed through, these ephemeral works left lasting impressions on audiences, reinforcing the idea that royal presence transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary, and the artists behind these spectacles shaped memory as surely as painters shaped likeness. The printing press expanded the role of artists further, for engravers and woodcutters reproduced royal images for mass circulation, and though print could not capture the full grandeur of painted portraits, it allowed standardized likenesses of monarchs to travel far beyond court circles, appearing in books, proclamations, and cheap broadsheets, thereby embedding royal faces into the consciousness of a literate and semi-literate public. And these artists, though often anonymous, extended the propaganda reach of the crown. The Tudor state maintained careful oversight of artists, controlling likeness through the use of authorized patterns that ensured uniformity, especially in Elizabeth's reign, where a council decree forbade unseemly portraits that might undermine the Queen's myth, and thus artists were both empowered and constrained, their creative freedom subordinated to political necessity, making them co-authors of monarchy's image rather than independent creators. Patronage was both carrot and stick, for artists relied on royal favor for commissions, payment, and prestige, and in exchange they delivered works that flattered, aggrandized, and mythologized with success, measured not in artistic innovation, but in political utility. And thus, the Tudor system turned art into a form of service, where brush, chisel, and loom served crown and dynasty above all else. The political stakes of artistry were immense, for a poorly executed or ill-conceived image could provoke embarrassment or mockery, and foreign ambassadors often judged monarchs by their portraits, sending reports of how Henry VIII looked bigger in picture than in life, or how Elizabeth I's beauty appeared ageless. And these judgments affected diplomacy, showing that the craft of artists influenced not only domestic perception, but international relations. Artists themselves often became symbols of the monarchy's reach, their work circulating across borders as diplomatic gifts or cultural exports, with Holbein's designs sent to Basil Hilliard's miniatures gifted to French courtiers and tapestries woven in Flanders, to Tudor specifications, each artifact extending the propaganda of magnificence beyond England's shores, embedding the dynasty's image in the courts of Europe. The manufacturing of splendor also encompassed music, poetry, and performance, for while painters provided likeness, musicians composed odes, and playwrights staged masques that reinforced dynastic myths. And though their art differed in medium, all contributed to a single ecosystem of propaganda, demonstrating that Tudor power rested not only on armies and councils, but on orchestrated creativity, where artists across disciplines collaborated in the service of image. In this symphony of craftsmanship, the monarch was both patron and product, commissioning works that in turn remade their identity. For Henry VIII without Holbein, Elizabeth without Hilliard, or the Tudors without their jewelers, tailors, and engravers would not have radiated the same aura of grandeur, and thus artistry was not peripheral, but central to governance, for it gave physical form to otherwise abstract claims of divine right, continuity, and majesty. By the end of the Tudor era, the role of artists in manufacturing splendor had set precedents for future monarchies, demonstrating how careful control of visual culture could consolidate power. And the legacy of this collaboration between ruler and creator would endure, with Stuart kings, Bourbon monarchs, and even modern states continuing to harness art as propaganda, a testament to the transformative power of brush, needle, and stagecraft in the service of political image. Part 12. Festivals, Masques, and Civic Rituals. Tudor propaganda reached its most immersive form in the great festivals, masques, and civic rituals that punctuated the calendar of the realm. For these events transformed cities and courts into theaters where monarchs performed power before their subjects, and through spectacle, allegory, and participation, they wove propaganda into the very rhythm of daily life, ensuring that loyalty was reinforced not just by portraits and proclamations, but by shared experiences of awe and wonder. Royal entries were among the most potent of these rituals, staged whenever a monarch visited a major city, and nowhere was this more elaborate than in London, where triumphal arches, pageant wagons, and decorated stages lined the streets, each bearing allegorical tableaux linking the ruler to virtues such as justice, wisdom, and piety. And these entries not only allowed the people to see their sovereign, but also gave them the sense of being co-authors in the monarchy's glory. For city officials, guilds, and schools all participated in the staging, binding civic pride to royal authority. Masques at court represented the more exclusive counterpart, lavish entertainments that combined music, poetry, dance, and elaborate costumes, where courtiers themselves often performed alongside professional actors, and while ostensibly designed for amusement, these spectacles were loaded with symbolism, presenting the monarch as the embodiment of harmony, order, or divine favor, And by watching or even joining these performances, elites were drawn deeper into the orbit of royal ideology, their participation reinforcing loyalty and dependence. Under Henry VIII, festivals often emphasized martial themes, with tilts and tournaments staged as displays of chivalric valor, where the king himself donned armor and appeared as a knight of near-mythic prowess, and such spectacles reinforced the propaganda of Henry as both ruler and warrior, a king whose physical strength mirrored his political authority, while also offering the crowd a carefully curated glimpse of majesty in motion, staged combat blurring into ritual affirmation of sovereignty. Elizabeth I's reign gave these entertainments new layers of allegory, for her unmarried status and cultivated virgin image were continually celebrated through masques that depicted her as Astrea, the returning goddess of justice, or Cynthia, the moon goddess untouched by corruption, and courtiers who devised these entertainments crafted elaborate praise that elevated her into mythic dimensions, so that each performance became both flattery and propaganda, transforming the queen into a divine figure, presiding over an eternal golden age. Civic festivals reinforced these messages on a broader scale. For May Day celebrations, midsummer bonfires and harvest rituals often included royal references, with pageants funded by guilds and towns to honor the monarchy. And these events blurred the line between local tradition and national propaganda, making the monarch not only the head of state, but also the symbolic participant in the cycles of nature and community life, so that ordinary subjects felt royal presence woven into their festive rhythms. The performative power of ritual extended into religious celebrations as well, though with shifting meanings under different rulers. For Catholic monarchs like Mary, I infused Corpus Christi processions and saints' days with overtly sacred imagery tied to royal authority, while Elizabeth's Protestant regime redirected such rituals into secular or allegorical frameworks, ensuring that while religious imagery shifted, the underlying principle of spectacle as propaganda endured, adapting to doctrinal needs while maintaining the theatrical affirmation of monarchy. Masques also functioned as subtle tools of diplomacy, for visiting ambassadors were invited to these performances and witnessed not only artistic brilliance, but also the careful staging of monarchy. S. Smith and foreign observers frequently reported the magnificence of Tudor entertainments, noting how allegories equated Elizabeth with goddesses or Henry with classical heroes, and such accounts spread beyond England, reinforcing the dynasty's image abroad as cultured, powerful, and divinely favored, thereby extending propaganda into the international sphere. The artistry of these events was extraordinary, involving painters, poets, musicians, architects, and engineers working together to create ephemeral wonders, from moving stage machinery that revealed allegorical gods descending from the heavens to fireworks exploding above rivers. And the sheer expense of these entertainments was itself propaganda, demonstrating royal wealth and the ability to command resources for pure spectacle, signaling stability and abundance to subjects who might otherwise question the realm's prosperity. For the people, festivals and civic rituals were not passive displays, but participatory moments, for cheering crowds, chanting guilds, and costume processions enacted loyalty publicly, making allegiance not an abstract idea, but a lived, communal act. And this participation mattered deeply, for it reinforced the bond between ruler and ruled, making propaganda a shared ritual rather than a distant imposition, ensuring its internalization through collective joy and spectacle. Yet beneath the glitter, these entertainments carried serious political purpose, for they could be used to reassert authority during times of unrest or uncertainty, reminding audiences of the monarch's grandeur when challenges threatened stability. And their repetition across reigns normalized the idea that monarchy was not merely a political system, but a divinely sanctioned performance. its authority inseparable from ritual affirmation, so that to cheer, watch, or dance was to endorse the order itself. The Tudor genius lay in their ability to fuse entertainment with ideology, ensuring that subjects walked away from festivals not merely amused, but convinced of the monarch's magnificence. And because such spectacles engaged sight, sound, and emotion, their propaganda was deeply visceral, harder to contest than words on a page or portraits on a wall. For once, someone had stood in a cheering crowd, watching their queen hailed as a goddess or their king triumph in a tilt. The memory lingered as lived truth. In the end, the festivals, masques, and civic rituals of the Tudor world show how power was not only asserted in councils and battlefields, but also staged on platforms in streets and in theatres where allegory, costume, and performance transformed political reality into living myth. And these spectacles remind us that propaganda was not only visual, but experiential, immersive events that bound people emotionally to monarchy, making loyalty a pageant as well as a duty and splendor itself, the most persuasive argument of Tudor rule. Part 13. The Tudor Rose as National Emblem. The Tudor rose stands as one of the most enduring symbols of dynastic propaganda in English history, for by uniting the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York into a single emblem, the Tudors condensed a century of conflict into an image of reconciliation, and in doing so, they turned a bloody past into a visual promise of peace, stability, and divine sanction. A promise repeated so often across stone, parchment, fabric, and glass that it became inseparable from the identity of monarchy itself. Several houses used roses to represent their claims, and though such imagery had limited reach during the conflict, Henry VII recognized its potential after his victory at Bosworth in 1485. For as a Lancastrian who married Elizabeth of York, he required a way to demonstrate that the bloodlines of rivals were reconciled in his person. Henry ensured that the Tudor rose appeared everywhere authority was expressed, carved into the stonework of Westminster Abbey, emblazoned on coins, embroidered into royal garments, and painted into manuscripts until the emblem became omnipresent, reinforcing that the dynasty itself embodied unity. And because symbols could be read without words, this was propaganda accessible to both literate and illiterate alike, a universal image of reconciliation projected across the kingdom. The rose carried layered meanings beyond dynastic union, for roses in Christian symbolism evoked purity, paradise, and divine favor, and by adopting the flower, the Tudors suggested that their rule was not only politically necessary, but also spiritually ordained, a reign blossoming under God's blessing, and this fusion of political and religious meaning made the emblem more than a family crest, transforming it into a sacred sign that merged heaven and earth in the body of the monarch. Henry VIII expanded its use dramatically, incorporating the rose into architectural schemes at Hampton Court, Whitehall, and other palaces, where ceilings, gates, and tapestries were crowded with roses intertwined with crowns, fleur-de-lis, and portcullises, so that visitors literally walked beneath a canopy of propaganda, their eyes constantly reminded that Tudor power was natural, flourishing, and eternal. And by embedding the rose in physical structures, Henry ensured that the emblem became part of the lived environment of the court. The rose also proved adaptable, appearing in numerous heraldic variations, from the crowned Tudor rose symbolizing sovereign authority to the double rose encircled by a garter indicating knighthood and loyalty, and each version reinforced the sense that the dynasty's identity permeated all ranks of society, binding nobles and commoners alike to the symbol of unity. for whether on coins held in a farmer's hand or banners waved at a procession, the rose spoke with equal authority. Elizabeth I inherited the emblem and gave it new layers of meaning, using it not only as a sign of dynastic legitimacy, but also as a metaphor for her own virginity and divine favor, with poets likening her to the rose without thorn, a symbol of purity and perfection. And in portraits, she was often surrounded by roses or adorned with floral embroidery, reinforcing her identity as the flowering of the Tudor line, the culmination of reconciliation blossoming into a golden age, so that the emblem transcended politics and entered the realm of poetic myth. Civic rituals amplified its significance, for pageants staged during royal progresses frequently presented living roses or artificial blossoms as symbols of loyalty. Children dressed as petals, welcoming the monarch, and entire streets decorated with garlands of roses, turning towns into blooming stages of propaganda, where the emblem's meaning was enacted, publicly binding local pride to royal image, and ensuring that the dynasty AS brand was not confined to palaces, but rooted in the everyday visual culture of the people. The rose's versatility also allowed it to appear in international diplomacy, with gifts bearing the emblem sent abroad, coins circulating across Europe, and foreign visitors reporting its omnipresence. And in this way, the Tudor rose proclaimed to the wider world that England was no longer a fractured realm, but a stable kingdom under a divinely sanctioned dynasty, projecting unity outward as well as inward, making the emblem a diplomatic as well as domestic tool. The durability of the Tudor rose lay in its ability to simplify complexity, for the Wars of the Roses had been bitter, bloody, and politically intricate, yet the emblem reduced the entire history to a single flower, suggesting that division was over, harmony restored, and thus the emblem did not merely commemorate the past, but actively rewrote it, replacing the memory of conflict with the myth of unity. And in this rewriting, propaganda proved stronger than history, for what people remembered was the rose rather than the wars. The repetition of the emblem embedded it so deeply in cultural consciousness that it transcended the dynasty itself, for even after the Tudors ended in 1603, the rose remained a national symbol, appearing in Stuart, Hanoverian, and even modern British iconography, demonstrating the extraordinary success of Tudor propaganda. For in creating the emblem, the dynasty forged not only its own legitimacy, but also a visual shorthand for England itself, proving that an image once planted can bloom far beyond its original purpose. Yet its power in the Tudor era was immediate and practical, for the emblem functioned as a seal of trust, a mark of belonging, and a constant reminder that the monarch embodied the union of rival houses. And in a time when legitimacy could be contested and loyalty fragile, the simple presence of a rose carved on a gate or stamped on a coin reassured subjects that their ruler stood above faction, the flowering center of harmony. And thus the Tudor rose did not merely decorate power, but actively constructed it. Ultimately, the Tudor rose shows the genius of Tudor propaganda, for in taking a fragile plant and turning it into a symbol of eternal unity, the dynasty harnessed the power of imagery to overcome the legacy of division. And by saturating the kingdom with this emblem, they created a visual world where every coin, wall, and page reminded subjects that monarchy was reconciliation embodied, ensuring that loyalty bloomed as naturally as roses in spring. And thus the emblem became not only the brand of a dynasty, but the blossom of a nation's identity. Part 14, Foreign Eyes and Diplomatic Images. Tudor propaganda did not stop at England's borders, for imagery was one of the most important tools in diplomacy, shaping how foreign courts saw the dynasty, and through portrait symbols and ceremonial display, the Tudors projected themselves as powerful, legitimate, and divinely favored rulers, ensuring that their image abroad supported alliances, discouraged rivals, and positioned England within the competitive world of European politics. One of the earliest examples lies with Henry VII, whose marriage to Elizabeth of York required not only domestic celebration but also international recognition, and portraits of the couple, their children and their emblems circulated abroad, emphasizing dynastic unity, while coins bearing the Tudor rose reached foreign merchants, turning trade into a vehicle of propaganda, so that even those who never set foot in England encountered the image of reconciliation and stability. Under Henry VIII, this international projection reached unprecedented heights, for the king understood that his personal image mattered as much abroad as at home, and Holbein's famous portraits were often created with diplomacy in mind. Sent to potential brides and foreign courts, their monumental scale and commanding composition designed to impress, intimidate, and convince, and foreign ambassadors often reported back not only on treaties, but on how Henry appeared in likeness, noting his size, dress, and majesty as evidence of power. The infamous episode of Holbein's portrait of Anne of Cleves demonstrates both the potency and the risks of this diplomatic imagery. For the flattering painting convinced Henry to pursue the marriage, though the reality disappointed him. Yet even in failure, the incident underscores how crucial portraits were in negotiations, standing in for personal encounters and shaping decisions of immense political consequence, with artists acting as silent ambassadors whose brushstrokes carried the weight of dynastic futures. Diplomatic gifts also bore Tudor imagery, with tapestries, jewel-encrusted objects, and illuminated manuscripts sent to foreign rulers, often laden with symbols such as the Tudor rose, imperial crowns, or allegorical scenes, each carefully designed to broadcast magnificence and assert equality with Europe's greatest dynasties. And these objects were not casual tokens, but calculated instruments of persuasion, intended to impress upon recipients the wealth, sophistication, and divine favor of the Tudor realm. Elizabeth refined this strategy to perfection, recognizing that her unmarried status made her a constant subject of diplomatic speculation, and portraits of her were circulated across Europe to potential suitors, each presenting her not only as youthful and beautiful, but as majestic and untouchable, carefully concealing signs of age or weakness. And by sending these controlled images abroad, Elizabeth managed her reputation as both desirable and inviolable, turning her very body into a theater of diplomacy. Ambassadors frequently commented on Elizabeth's imagery, noting the consistency of her portraits and the elaborate symbolism woven into them, and some complained that the Queen controlled access so tightly that even they had difficulty obtaining likenesses, for she understood the risks of unflattering images reaching foreign eyes, and thus she ensured that only authorized versions circulated, demonstrating an extraordinary awareness of how visual propaganda shaped not just domestic but international perceptions. Ceremonial encounters reinforced these visual strategies, for when foreign envoys visited the English court, they were treated to carefully staged displays of magnificence. From processions through palaces adorned with Tudor roses, to masques and tournaments in which allegories elevated the monarch to divine status. And these spectacles were designed to leave lasting impressions, so that when ambassadors wrote to their masters, they described not only policies but splendor, framing England as a realm of cultivated majesty and disciplined image-making. Foreign monarchs responded in kind, sending portraits of themselves and their kin, and this exchange of images became a language of diplomacy, where likenesses stood in for presence, and symbols embedded within them conveyed political messages. so that when Elizabeth was shown as youthful, radiant, and surrounded by symbols of purity, foreign courts were reminded that she was not merely a woman without a husband, but a queen chosen by God, an image crafted to resist pressure to marry and assert sovereignty in her own right. The use of imagery in diplomacy also extended to military triumphs, most famously in depictions of the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, for the Armada portrait circulated beyond England as a visual statement of Protestant triumph and divine favor, showing Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen with her hand upon the globe, while the defeated Spanish fleet sank in the background. And such images were both reassurance to allies and warning to enemies, embedding military victory into a symbolic framework that transcended borders. Printing presses amplified this international reach, as engravings and pamphlets carrying Tudor symbols and portraits spread across Protestant Europe, often portraying Elizabeth as the champion of the Protestant cause, a bulwark against Catholic aggression. And these images elevated her into a continental figure, far more than a national monarch, while reinforcing England's reputation as a small but divinely protected realm capable of defying great empires. Foreign observers sometimes reacted skeptically, noting the discrepancy between image and reality. For ambassadors reported that Elizabeth appeared older in person than her portrait suggested, or that Henry VIII's magnificence sometimes masked political difficulties. Yet the very fact that such observations were recorded proves the power of the imagery, for it set expectations, framed encounters, and shaped the language through which diplomats understood their hosts. So that even when questioned, propaganda still defined the terms of perception. The international success of Tudor imagery lay in its ability to universalize local concerns. For the Tudor rose, portraits of Majesty or depictions of naval triumph were all designed to resonate beyond England, presenting the dynasty not merely as rulers of a small island, but as participants in the great narratives of Christendom: unity, divine favor, chastity, victory. Concepts that all European courts understood and respected, making Tudor propaganda a flexible and translatable language of power. Ultimately, the foreign projection of Tudor imagery reveals how propaganda was not only inward-facing but outward-reaching, a diplomacy of pictures and symbols that ensured England was seen as stable, majestic, and divinely favored even when its politics were fraught. And in this lies the true brilliance of Tudor propaganda, for it turned perception into policy, ensuring that in the eyes of Europe, the dynasty appeared greater, stronger, and more legitimate than its material resources alone might have suggested. Part 15. The Afterlife of Tudor Propaganda. When the Tudor dynasty ended in 1603 with the death of Elizabeth I, the images and symbols they had cultivated did not vanish, but instead took on new life, reshaped by later generations who continued to draw upon Tudor propaganda as a reservoir of legitimacy, nostalgia, and cultural memory. For the portraits, emblems, and pageantry that once served immediate political purposes became lasting icons of English identity, reframed to serve shifting needs of monarchy, nation, and myth. The Jacobean court inherited much of this visual legacy, with James I carefully positioning himself as the continuation of Tudor majesty. And though he emphasized his own lineage through the Stuarts, the presence of Tudor symbols in public buildings, coins, and ceremonies ensured that the aura of stability and divine favor associated with Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I was carried into the Stuart age, a reminder that legitimacy could be inherited not only through blood, but through imagery. Portraiture, once a carefully controlled instrument of Tudor propaganda, became a model for future monarchs, with Elizabeth's iconic Masque of Youth inspiring later rulers to commission idealized likenesses that concealed flaws and projected majesty. And artists such as Van Dyck, employed by Charles I, built on Tudor traditions of monumental scale and symbolic embellishment, embedding political meaning into visual form in ways pioneered by the Tudors. The Tudor rose, perhaps the most enduring symbol of the dynasty, outlived its original political function of reconciling York and Lancaster, evolving into a broader emblem of England itself. Appearing in heraldry, architecture and literature long after the Wars of the Roses faded from memory, and even today it remains a national symbol, proof of how Tudor propaganda transcended its origins to become timeless. In the realm of religion, Tudor iconography shaped perceptions for centuries. For Elizabeth's carefully crafted imagery as the Protestant Virgin Queen endured in Protestant memory, celebrated in sermons, engravings, and histories throughout the 17th century, particularly during conflicts with Catholic powers, where she was invoked as a symbol of divine protection and national independence. Her Armada portraits and festival imagery, repurposed to inspire new generations facing different threats. The myth of Elizabeth as a Golden Age monarch also flourished in literature, with poets and playwrights of the 17th and 18th centuries looking back to her reign as a period of cultural flowering, stability, and patriotic triumph. And this myth owed as much to the propaganda she herself had fostered as to reality, for the careful control of her image in life made it easier to canonize her in death, elevating her into a figure larger than history, an icon of England's destiny. The Tudors' use of pageantry and spectacle likewise influenced later politics, with Stuart and Hanoverian monarchs adopting grand ceremonies, coronations, and civic entertainments that consciously echoed Tudor precedents, recognizing that visual theatre could cement authority, while writers and antiquarians preserved descriptions of Tudor masques and progresses, ensuring that their style remained part of England's ceremonial vocabulary. In popular memory, Henry VIII's imposing portraits became symbols of strength and excess, a monarch remembered for both magnificence and tyranny, and over time this dual image was mythologized, with later generations alternately condemning him as a despot or celebrating him as a king of power and vigor. And this cultural afterlife demonstrates how Tudor propaganda could be reinterpreted, its visual language providing raw material for new narratives across centuries. Printed images ensured the survival of Tudor propaganda, for engravings of monarchs, symbols, and triumphs circulated long after the dynasty's fall, appearing in histories, almanacs, and popular works that kept their memory alive. And in this sense, the printing press made Tudor imagery immortal, embedding it into the cultural fabric of England, where it could be reshaped to meet new contexts. The 19th century, with its fascination for history and monarchy, revived Tudor propaganda with particular fervor. As Victorians looked back on Henry VIII and Elizabeth I as symbols of national strength, imperial ambition, and moral authority, reproducing their portraits in books, exhibitions, and public spaces. And in this era, the Tudors became central to the creation of a patriotic narrative of English greatness. Their propaganda repurposed to support Victorian ideals of empire and identity. In modern times, Tudor imagery continues to shape popular imagination, from television dramas to heritage tourism, where the portraits of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and their symbols adorn palaces, museums, and cultural products. And though centuries have passed, the underlying messages crafted in their lifetimes remain effective. For audiences still associate Elizabeth with virgin majesty, Henry VIII with commanding strength, and the Tudor rose with national unity, demonstrating the extraordinary longevity of their visual strategies. The afterlife of Tudor propaganda reveals an essential truth about imagery. Once created, it escapes the control of its makers, becoming part of a larger cultural conversation. And while the Tudors shaped their portraits and pageantry for immediate political needs, those same images evolved into myths, repurposed across generations for causes they could never have foreseen. From Protestant resistance to Victorian empire to 21st century entertainment. Yet the enduring fascination with Tudor imagery also reflects its sophistication, for the dynasty mastered the language of power through image, with such skill that even today their portraits command attention, their symbols resonate, and their festivals inspire reenactment. And in this lies their ultimate achievement, not merely in ruling England, but in ruling memory, crafting a legacy so powerful that it survived their fall and continues to define English culture centuries later. Thus, the story of Tudor propaganda does not end in 1603, but unfolds across time, a testament to the durability of images and the ways in which power, once encoded in portrait, symbol, and spectacle, can echo through history long after the dynasty that produced it has passed away. Thank you for joining us on this deep exploration of Tudor imagery and influence. If you enjoyed this journey through royal portraits, pageantry, and the myths that shaped England, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More fascinating stories of history's hidden strategies await you here.